Good morning. Hello, everyone. I'm Ann Lewis. I am the team lead for Macroblitz, and today we're talking to Macroblitz team member and New Jersey School of Conservation Education Director, Tanya Sulikowski. Good morning, Tanya.
Good morning, Ann. Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and today we are going to talk about how to find macroinvertebrates. So I am a wildlife biologist, and I'm also part of the education team for Macroblitz and a Grosvenor Teaching Fellow. I did my thesis on macroinvertebrates, and so I'm excited to share some information with you about habitat types. I know Ann's talked a little bit about the Macroblitz project and gearing up, and so now it makes sense for us to start thinking about where we can go look for these wonderful little creatures. So our learning objectives for today's module are that you will be able to identify habitat elements that are important to macroinvertebrates, describe how habitat features determine occurrence and distribution of macroinvertebrates, distinguish between lotic and lentic habitats, and understand differences in sampling locations in these two different types of systems. So macroinvertebrates are living organisms just like us, and there are certain things that they need in order to be able to survive. The four main ones that we'll focus on today are relevant to you if you're thinking about habitat selection, and those are oxygen, substrate, vegetation, and structure. And we'll look at details for each one of these in the upcoming slides. So what do they need to survive? Well, macroinvertebrates breathe oxygen, and sometimes that oxygen is dissolved in water, and sometimes they obtain that oxygen from the surface. So in the picture to the right, you can see a mayfly, and that mayfly has very prominent gills. That's an adaptation for that animal to be able to pull dissolved oxygen from the water. Different types of macroinvertebrates get oxygen in different ways. And things like diving beetles may actually swim up to the surface and grab a little air bubble and take it down beneath the surface with them, kind of like a little scuba tank if it's a low oxygen system. And things like mosquitoes may have a siphon attached to their body that they would use if they go to the surface to grab oxygen from there. So those adaptations are interesting, one of the interesting things about macroinvertebrates, but it's important to know how those critters get oxygen from different types of systems. Substrate is arguably one of the most important habitat features, and numerous studies have shown that the substrate is generally what dictates the diversity and abundance of creatures that you're going to find. And this is basically what the habitat bottom is comprised of. And examples of things like this are sand, silt, gravel, and cobble. And in streams, typically we have larger pieces of substrate like the gravel and the cobble. And here in this picture, you'll see the shoreline of a lake with a sandy bottom. Those particles are very small, they're close together. And so you would have to find organisms that are more well adapted to that smaller particle size. Vegetation is also very important, and vegetation provides food sources for macroinvertebrates and also breeding grounds. And vegetation in a stream corridor like this typically is pretty sparse in the water because the water's moving fast, and it's difficult for aquatic vegetation to find anchor points. But in some slower moving areas, like little pools along the side, you might be able to find some things growing. The adjacent vegetation here is really important because those trees that are along the edges of the stream corridor are going to provide shade, and that will make our water temperature much cooler, as opposed to a system like a lake where there's a lot more vegetation that's coming up out of the water, emergent vegetation like cattails and maybe water lilies, but there's not going to be a lot of adjacent vegetation. So that water body gets a lot more sun, and chances are the temperature there is much warmer. And then the last habitat feature that we'll talk about is structure. So logs, sticks, woody debris are important things to consider when you're looking at habitat. And here in the stream, you can see there's some trees along the shoreline here. As branches fall into the water and start to decompose, that creates a really complex habitat, microhabitat structure for microorganisms. And it provides lots of little nooks and crannies for them to hide in. It provides a place for algae to grow that they might feed on. And so those are important features to consider. In a body of water like a pond, you probably wouldn't have as much woody debris, and so your structure would be more like the vegetation that you'd look to for sampling. So habitat features determine occurrence and distribution, and we'll talk a little bit more about lotic versus lentic habitats. But one thing that's important to know is that aquatic macroinvertebrates can be found in almost any water system. So a tiny little temporary vernal pool in the middle of a stream, in the middle of a forest, a large river, or a large lake, all of those are great habitats for macroinvertebrates. Now we'll look at a little bit more detail about lotic and lentic freshwater ecosystems. So lotic, I always remember lotic, like flowing, low flow. So lotic ecosystems are flowing water, like streams, and lentic ecosystems are standing water, like lakes and ponds. And let's talk a little bit more about the lotic. So examples, as we said, streams, rivers, springs. The water flows in a continuous and definite direction. It's pretty linear, often more shallow than something like a large lake. And the sources of water for those lotic ecosystems are usually lower order streams, precipitation, springs that are bubbling up in the woods. The velocity there is high. And as that water is traveling quickly over larger substrate particles like the gravel and the cobble and the boulders, it creates a lot of turbulence, which results in higher dissolved oxygen. And that's important because that will determine what kind of macroinvertebrate community that we have there. Typically things that like more oxygen in the water. And as we said before, in-stream vegetation is a little sparser in a lotic system because the water's moving fast and it's harder for plants to take root. So you might not find a lot of aquatic vegetation there unless you're sampling those little still areas along the sides. And then adjacent trees provide shade. So again, we'll probably have cooler water temperature in our lotic systems. In a lentic system, like the lake pictured on the right, we have mostly standing water. Typically, it's circular and deeper, fed by higher order streams. Groundwater is often an important source of water there, and of course, precipitation. The water is going to move a lot slower there. We have finer sediments, and so we have much lower dissolved oxygen typically in lentic systems like that one. We'll have more emergent vegetation. And this picture was taken in the winter, but you can see that little patch of cattails that's still sticking out of the water. So during the growing season, that would be a really robust source of emergent vegetation. There are also water lilies that grow in this lake, which would be important for breeding and structure. And there's less adjacent vegetation here. So chances are the temperature in this system would be a whole lot warmer than what we see in our lotic systems. Okay, so now we're going to just talk a little bit more about sampling locations in these two different types of systems. So if you're sampling in a stream, you're thinking about the resources that are there. Rocks and sediment on the stream bottom are great places to look for macroinvertebrates. Lots of nooks and crannies, big particles that are next to each other. So there's crevices in there for them to hide. There's an opportunity for lots of things to grow on those rocks, like algae. So we have lots of scraping organisms. So those would be a great locations to look. As we said, probably not a whole lot of plants in the stream. If there are slower areas, there will be accumulations of leaf litter, things we like to call leaf packs, other decomposing organic material, and then some of that woody debris. All that stuff kind of piles up in there, and it creates these great little nooks and crannies for them to feed on, find shelter. And so those are great places for sampling. And then the other thing to just think about is because the water's moving quickly here over those large particles, we have these well-oxygenated riffle areas. So if you see an area in a stream where the water's turbulent, that's a great place to go out and sample because there's a lot of oxygen there. So you would be likely to find a high number of organisms in those areas. So we've got a fun little activity here for you. This wonderful artist, Amy Bartlett, created these illustrations as part of a guide to freshwater invertebrates of North America. And she depicts the underwater scene of a lotic or flowing habitat here. And I want you to look at this picture and see how many macroinvertebrates you can find. And well, just the characteristics, you can see at the surface, the water's flowing. There's some texture there. There's some vegetation growing underneath. So this might be one of those slower areas of the stream. There's some accumulated leaf material. There are some sticks. You can see at the substrate, there's some larger pieces of gravel and cobble. And so I'm going to give you just a few seconds here and see if you can count to see how many different macroinvertebrates you can find.
Do you want me to play, Tanya? I'm
Sure.
really curious. Yeah. Okay. So this is fun. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that one? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? Did I find them all? Did I count some twice?
You didn't, Anne. You didn't find them all. And
Dang.
here's I won't tell anyone, don't worry.
Just everyone watching this.
Okay, so here's the key for that illustration. And you see which ones you missed?
Yeah, but go ahead and go through them all. Yeah.
Okay, so you can see there's some kind of hunkered down in those little vegetation areas on the right. We've got some sitting on the surface of the rocks that are probably scraping some algae, some that are floating in the water column. Then you can see there's a couple that are kind of buried doing their own thing down there. And I don't know if everybody can see, but there's that little crayfish. He's kind of right in the center. You can see his big claw sticking out. So all those different strata within that lotic habitat are creating these wonderful little microhabitats for our organisms to take advantage of. And I'll show you and just take a look and see if you can see. Here's the illustration again. So now you'll have a chance to see which ones you missed, all 14 of them.
Yep. I missed the crayfish. I missed the black flies. I missed, is that a mayfly over on the right in the tuft of vegetation?
Yep. You can see those 3 tails there. Yep.
Yeah, I think I
those are tough ones.
Yeah. And part of it's because this is a live stream, my screen is smaller. I say trying to salvage my pride.
Awesome.
Yeah.
You do great in a real sampling situation, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I think there's some in the leaf litter that I missed too. I'd have to go back to the schema
Gotcha.
to double check.
All right. Well, you'll have another one coming up. You can practice again.
All right.
And speaking of Ann Lewis, here she is in a photo. So we just did the lotic habitat. So here's lentic, lake and pond surveys. And when we're thinking about sampling locations in these systems, it's a little bit different, right? Because our habitat structure looks very different. So we don't have a lot of surrounding vegetation here. So we're going to be relying on emergent vegetation for sampling. And the bank margins are a great place to do this. And by bank margins, we mean the area right around the edge of this habitat. So there could be some overhanging vegetation. There's lots of submerged root mats. There's leaf packs where there's, all kinds of things trapped in those root wads. And those can be highly productive because there's a lot of material for the macroinvertebrates to eat there, all those little crevices for them to hide in. And our substrate here looks really different, right? Particles are really small. And so, agitating that substrate is a great way to dislodge some of those organisms and get to see them in your sampling. You might have some algae covered rocks. There's a lot of sun exposure here for things to grow on. And in terms of snags and logs, there's not a lot of snags and logs here for sampling, right? Because there's not a lot of adjacent woody vegetation. If there is some in the location where you're sampling, that's a great place to go concentrate some of your efforts. All right, so another Amy Bartlett illustration here. This one is for our lentic habitat. Looks a little different. You can see the aquatic vegetation on the surface and emerging. There is one log here, so there must have been some tree close by. And you can see here the vegetation looks different, right? It's well anchored because there's not a lot of flow in this system. And so there's a much more abundant sampling location here because we have that that vegetation. And then if you look at the sediment or the substrate, it looks much finer here. So this looks very different than the other illustration that we saw. All right, so now we've got another shot at it. I'm gonna give you a second to look and see how many macroinvertebrates you can count.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I have a feeling I missed one, but I think there are 14 in this one.
Ah, and you can tell you're a woman that is a frequent lentic habitat sampler.
I am actually. I don't do much. South Dakota doesn't have a lot for lotic systems where I live, so.
Well, you got them all 14. So Amy Bartlett was tricky. She put 14 in each picture. So these were a little bit easier to spot because there's less complexity in this habitat, right? I mean, there's still a lot of different little nooks and crannies and microhabitats here, but a little bit more open. And the macroinvertebrates in the system are taking advantage of those resources. So I like the little aquatic worm sticking out of the substrate there. You can see him. And then, we've got some folks hanging on to vegetation there, taking advantage of that accumulated leaf pack. And, there's a lot less oxygen in here. So we've got things that are more likely to float up to the surface and be more visible, like the diving beetle and that water strider at the surface. And there is our illustration again. So if there were any that you missed, not like Ann Lewis, she got them all, but if anybody missed any, there you might be able to pick out one or two that you didn't get in the first round. Okay. And so that's kind of a big picture overview of, the different habitat types that we would be sampling for macroinvertebrates, the features of those habitats that you would need to consider, what the different assets are in each one of those habitats. And hopefully you have a sense now of what the difference is between lotic and lentic and the different sampling strategies that you would use in each one of those habitats. So now it's time to think about collection. The next module in our series will be module 4, and we will encourage you to get out and start collecting benthic macroinvertebrates. So you'll get some more information about how to do that. And remember to have fun while you're out there for science and for learning. Happy macro blitzing.
That's great. Thank you, Tanya. That was a lot of fun. And if you're looking for a copy of those photos or those drawings with the answer key, check out our Google Classroom, which is we'll have a link to how you can sign up for that in the notes to this. And happy macro blitzing. And thanks again. Have a great day.